Thank you for coming. So today we have this event on ISIS in North Africa. I'm David Sterman, a Senior Policy Analyst here at New America. And then to discuss this issue, we have Sarah Yerkes, who's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, formerly worked on the State Department's policy planning staff regarding North Africa. And then we have Zelin, who's a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and works on jihadism broadly, but also specifically North Africa and Tunisia, and who is writing a book on jihadism in Tunisia. So what we're going to do is I'm going to present you a couple of findings from our report we released recently here at New America, All Jihad is Local, ISIS in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Then we'll turn it over to our speakers for their thoughts on what the future of jihadism in this region and the future of the region more broadly is. And then we'll have a discussion with us and with you. So thanks. So as I mentioned, going to give you a sense of our findings on ISIS in North Africa. These findings are drawn from the paper that I mentioned. What it works with is 961 ISIS personnel records of fighters who came from North Africa or reported coming from North Africa. Basically, when an ISIS fighter entered Syria, they'd be sat down with an ISIS official who had essentially a Google Sheets open and was filling out answers to a variety of demographic questions. You can see this sort of national breakdown there. We took those questions and scored the most relevant and useful ones, 1 to 5 in an ordinal ranking, for a very simple look at the sort of socioeconomic status of these fighters. So we scored questions like previous job, educational level, marital status. A couple of quick notes here. One of the key aspects of our report is that we took this down to the local level, so not just what country they're from, but what province they've reported residing in. And there are, of course, a number of limits on what our data can say. Perhaps the most important is this data covers pretty much entirely 2013 to 2014. It's only people who went to Syria, only those who went to fight with ISIS, so it does not include Al-Qaeda or other Syrian militant groups. Of course, the findings here can suggest a lot of things, and what we will present here has a lot more detail than what had previously been discussable about these local dynamics, which often relied on expert opinion and anecdote. But it's easy to get too focused in on the data just because there is data. And then finally, there's, of course, as with all terrorism study, a lot of flux. So there are patterns, but those patterns are never fully explaining what's going on. So here we have a map of North Africa from our report. The lighter pink is where fighters came at a lower per capita rate, fighters per 100,000 Sunni residents. And the darker ones are where fighters came at a higher rate. What we found in our report is that there's 3 key patterns operating in North Africa at this time period regarding radicalization. The first is provinces with a high rate were provinces that were particularly hit by the Arab Spring and its aftermath. So 19 of the top 20 provinces in North Africa were in Libya and Tunisia, the 2 countries where the existing government fell during the Arab Spring. You have a high number of people coming from Morocco, but it has a high population. So you actually have a very low rate. In Morocco, they had fewer protests by the Armed Conflict and Location Event Database, which we looked at for the Arab Spring period. And also, they had tighter controls of their borders. Similarly, in Algeria, we saw a similar dynamic. In Algeria, there were only 26 fighters, actually, remarkably low. They're not in any particular hotspots. So that's also important. The second is the key hotspots had conditions of economic marginalization and political marginalization. So in Libya, we have hotspots in eastern Libya, which was systematically marginalized by the Gaddafi government. And then in Tunisia, we saw hotspots in the rural south along the border with Libya, as well as in the poorer suburbs of the capital region. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. And the final one is these high-producing provinces were often sites of broader trends of high rates of protests per capita in the 2011 to 2014 period, and also had histories of jihadism. Perhaps most notably and most clear in eastern Libya, which had Islamist organizing going back to the 70s and 80s, a full-blown insurgency led by the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in the 90s, followed by a similar mass mobilization of fighters to Iraq in the 2000s, and then was where the Arab Spring really took off in Libya, and then the ISIS fighters that we look at. So those are the key three patterns. Now we'll look at them sort of country by country. Or first, a bit about economic marginalization. So on the left, your left, you have a scatter plot of the average prior employment score for fighters in the top 20 provinces of North Africa, and then their rate on the y-axis. And what you can see here is there's a pretty clear pattern, although there's a lot of flux, where places where fighters reported less stable employment, with one being the least, either unemployed agricultural work or day labor, and 5 being the most advanced skills work. And you can see this clear pattern. We see that also when we look at the national level, that Libya and Tunisia had fighters who reported worse off jobs as well as poorer marital statuses. More of them were single, fewer of them had kids than Algeria and Morocco. So looking at Tunisia, Tunisia is often represented as a place that doesn't actually fit this set of patterns. That derives, in my view, from a couple of dynamics. First, the Tunisian fighter mobilization was just so large that it was to be expected you'd get fighters from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds. Similarly, it was widespread throughout the country. On your left here, you have a map of the percent of the Tunisian contingent from each province. With the exception of Tunis itself, you have fewer than 10% of the fighters in each province. So you'll often hear in discussions of Tunisia that everyone you talk to knows someone who was a fighter or knows at least a family member of a fighter. What this produces is it's very easy to get atypical examples if you just go and interview people about the ISIS mobilization or ISIS support. But what we found when we looked at our particular sample here is that while there's widespread production across the provinces in absolute numbers, there's clear hotspots in per capita terms. And you can see that on the right. So moving to those hotspots, we divided Tunisia into 4 geographic sections. The place that produced the most fighters per capita was the Grand Tunis region, or the metropolitan area of the capital. In Grand Tunis, you have a fighter rate of 8.1, so this is quite high, the highest of these 4 regions. They reported a prior job score of 2.4. That's the same as Tunisia overall. That's, however, a little surprising given this is the capital region and where many of the jobs are centralized. And then finally, fighter underemployment, so people who reported being unemployed, day labor, agricultural work, being a student, or unskilled labor, was about 50% of the fighter contingent in this region. What we found, and what is consistent with a bunch of more anecdotal looks at ISIS mobilization and jihadist mobilization in Grand Tunis, is that there are peripheries within it and neighborhoods that are hotspots. So one of these that we looked at is Et Hamen. It had a high rate of fighter production, 3 times that of the overall Grand Tunis region. When we looked at the job score, the fighters from that reported worse off prior employment than fighters from Grand Tunis overall. In fact, as you'll see in a moment, that job score is similar to what we found in the southern border areas. Fighter underemployment was at 65%. And it's also worth noting that there's a lack of services in this neighborhood, and it was also one of the hubs of the Arab Spring in Grand Tunis and protests. So if we move to the southern border, we found a hotspot in Kabylie. where you have 17.4 fighters per 100,000 Sunnis in our data. Again, we have a job score of 2.0, similar to what we found at Etnamen. Fighter underemployment is at 70%. And what we found is this is also, by the census numbers, the 5th highest unemployment in 2014. So you have both the fighters and the province itself having this poor employment situation. If you move to sort of the coast of the southern area, you have Medellin. Actually, here we found people reporting better jobs than overall in Tunisia. And this is another example of why you need local analysis. What we found was, well, they reported better jobs. In our view, that's quite misleading. In fact, those better jobs were pretty much all a product of a high rate of trading jobs, likely to have been in the illicit economy or smuggling economy in this region, which plays a key role. In addition, we find this sort of localized peripheries within the broader province. So Ben Gurdon had 40% of the fighters from this province, which is more than we'd expect based just on its population. In addition, it had, so that's 2.5 times the rate, and also Ben Gurdon is one of the higher unemployment areas in this province, more than the province overall. In contrast, we only found one fighter from the island of Jerba where unemployment, unlike, I believe it's at 18% in the 2014 census in Ben Gurdon, it was about 9 to 10% based on what subdivision of Jerba you found. And that area was not really producing fighters in our examination. So now we look at Libya. This is a much more classic example of the three patterns. 8 out of 10 fighters came from the east. 2 hotspots, the darkest one you see is Derna. Widely reported, this is the highest rate in the world that we found for a province. Also, we have a job score that's quite low for the sample, 1.8. Also, you have about 76% underemployment from the fighters reporting. We don't really have good unemployment numbers for Libya from government data, but a bunch of sort of reported aspects suggest that it is quite high in Derna, higher than elsewhere. Also, interestingly, a plurality of fighters from Derna had less than a high school education. Derna has also got a long history of jihadist organizing and was at the center of the Arab Spring protests. It was also actually called out specifically by Gaddafi in the famous speech that really in some ways triggered US intervention. Moving elsewhere, the second hotspot is Benghazi. It actually has a rate about a third of what we see in Derna. Correspondingly, the economic condition of fighters from there is actually a bit better. Benghazi was traditionally the center of the eastern region of Libya. Also, Benghazi at times would get some limited support from the Gaddafi regime, although here and there not as strong as the West. And if we move to the West, we see only 18 fighters from this area out of a sample of 103. They have a job score that's actually above that of the region overall. This is not a particularly marginalized set for the Libyan contingent. And it's also not producing fighters at the same rate. So I just want to quickly, before I end, pull us out of the North Africa region and show how these dynamics are very specific to this region. So here we have Bahrain. Bahrain is interesting. It produces 21 fighters, home to Muharraq, which is another of the top global per capita producers of fighters in our data. The mobilization in Bahrain is really new. There were no fighters from Bahrain found in the Sinjar records. There were only 6, I believe, in the Guantanamo files for covering people picked up in mostly Afghanistan, Pakistan. Only one of these fighters from the ISIS files reported having fought in a previous jihad. Now, that's somewhat similar to what we see in Tunisia. However, it's far below the 56% of Libyan fighters who reported previous jihadist experience, mostly in Libya. Also, this is not a particularly poor region. It's actually core to the Bahraini government's suppression of Arab Spring protests in Bahrain. And we see that there's a very clear ideological element where 17 fighters said they were recommended by Turki bin Ali from a prominent family, became ISIS's top religious official. And then another 4 were recommended by Abu Jandal al-Kuwaiti, who had another key top military position in ISIS and came out of the Kuwaiti scene, which a lot of reporting suggests is quite connected to the governing elite politically and religiously. So then just finally, what can we conclude? Well, there are a couple. North Africa has a sort of its own pattern of radicalization. Those patterns are quite local. Specifically, we have the Arab Spring effect, the existing marginalization that was built off of that, and then we have this prior history of jihadism and protest. This appears to be different from what we saw in the Arabian Peninsula. And then finally, I think that one of the key aspects is that many of these factors remain unresolved in the region, which is something we'll talk more about, whether that provides ISIS a chance to regrow itself after it's seen defeats, not just in Syria and Iraq, but also has lost a lot of its, at least territorial expression for the moment in North Africa. So with that, I throw it to our 2 speakers to give a brief discussion of their thoughts of where ISIS came from, where it is now, and where it will go in North Africa.
Great, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will say I've been anticipating this report after seeing a little bit of a teaser a few months ago. I think it's fabulous. Especially the graphics are really, really useful for our understanding. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the themes that came out of the report and kind of situate them with where we are today. And as I'll mention, we're in a kind of special moment, particularly in Tunisia, with municipal elections about to take place in less than 2 weeks. And so one of the things that I think came out of here is something that we've all been talking about for a long time, all of us who follow North Africa, which is the idea of regional disparity. And I think, whether we look at this as a political issue or an economic issue, what this report has really done is show that the difference between regions, the idea that there's vast socioeconomic disparities between regions in all of the North African countries, but particularly in the cases of Tunisia and Libya, these are not just socioeconomic issues, these are actually security issues that need to be addressed for security reasons as well as for other reasons. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is the fact that the Arab Spring itself started in one of these marginalized regions, in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. And I was there a couple months ago, and what's really striking is that while there has been tremendous headway and there's been a lot of government investment into that particular region, the same sort of long-standing frustrations of the marginalized communities, the people who live there, that feed into ISIS, that feed into recruitment patterns that we see in this report, those things still exist today. And so the idea that we're 7 years past the kind of recognition in this one town that people are so angry and frustrated they're able to overthrow a 30-year dictator, that stuff's still there, that's a problem. And I think the Tunisian government gets that, but we can talk a little bit about how well they're addressing that issue. One thing in the paper that I want to push back on a tiny bit is the idea that the Arab Spring caused Tunisia's foreign fighter problem, or kind of its ISIS problem in general. And while clearly, opening up the jails and letting bad guys out was not a good thing, and the post sort of revolution chaos and the government's struggle, which they're still dealing with today, to figure out this line between freedom and democracy on the one hand and security challenges on the other, these things are still real. But I think the factors that feed terrorist recruitment, that again were confirmed in the paper, this idea of socioeconomic inequality, people feel abandoned by the state, and they don't have the ability to impact their own lives or to make positive changes in their own lives. These things were all a lot worse under Ben Ali than they are today, or than they were sort of in the early years of the Arab Spring. And as I said, I think the Tunisian government in particular, and I think Libya is a very different case. It's very difficult to even talk about a Libyan government, but the idea that the Tunisian government sort of understands this and they're getting a much better handle on the security situation and how to address the idea of dignity, but they're not there yet. And as I mentioned, you still hear a lot of the same frustrations that you saw before. But we're in this really unique period, which is the Tunisian elections. So they're going to be having their very first ever democratic local elections on May 6th in less than 2 weeks. And these are a real opportunity and a chance for the country and for the government to address some of the regional imbalances that I've talked about. The primary vehicle that they're doing this is through what they call positive discrimination. And this is something that is a very real serious program for the Tunisian government. It's enshrined in the constitution. And the idea is that they will provide for equitable rather than equal resource distribution across the country. So the idea that the people in the most marginalized communities, which happen to be the ones that are the highest contributors to ISIS, that the government is actively going to shift resources there in the short term and the long term to get everyone kind of on the same playing field. And in reality, you've had these sort of tax incentives and investment bonuses for the marginalized interior since the 1970s, but they haven't really done much. So I think this is just kind of something to look for in the future. Is this positive discrimination going to work? What is that model? Is it actually something that the governments and the newly elected local officials who've never held any sort of political power before, are they going to actually be able to take advantage of this and address some of these key concerns and these key drivers of extremism? And the flip side of that is that I think, the report really talks a lot about this idea of relative deprivation. So it's not just that people are worse off than other places, it's that they're worse off relative to someone else that they can see or that they can actually feel. And this is why I think you see the Tunis and the Tunis suburbs issue, where some of the highest towns, highest levels of recruitment are in the suburbs of Tunis, where you have simultaneously the wealthiest part of Tunisia, Tunis, and then you also have some of the worst off neighborhoods. It's this idea of people seeing their neighbors and seeing the idea that look how much better they have it than me. And so I do worry a little bit that this idea of positive discrimination could backfire in that sense. And you already see this in Sidi Bouzid, the birthplace of the revolution, where if you drive from Tunis to Sidi Bouzid, the road outside Tunis is great. It's a beautiful highway like you'd find anywhere else. And then all of a sudden you get into this middle area where it's like a dirt road. And you can't even pass barely on the road. It takes you forever to kind of drive there. And then right outside of Sidi Bouzid, it's a beautiful road. And they rebuilt this road after the revolution, that they wanted to pour investment into Sidi Bouzid. But you still have this middle area, and it's not done yet. And I think they'll get there. I mean, part of the reason it's a dirt road is because they're trying to fix the road. But this idea that it's relative deprivation, that you look around you, and it's not just that you're not doing well, it's that you're not doing well compared to someone else. And then the final point I'll make is just I think the point that's made in the report about the history of prior jihadist activity is really important in the case of North Africa. And if you look back at history and look at various conflict in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now this conflict with ISIS, the same towns, the same communities are the ones who sent high numbers of foreign fighters. So it's not just, again, this idea that Tunisia was, for a long time, I think they're not anymore, the #1 contributor of foreign fighters to ISIS. So that's bad, but it's much more of a manageable problem than it seems to be, in that if you dig down to the local level, as this report has done, and really tackle these communities that for decades have sent tons and tons of foreign fighters, that's where you're going to be able to solve this problem if the government's able to tackle that. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I just want to thank David. I want to commend you and Nate on this report. I think it's really well done. I agree with Sarah too that looking at the local factors is important as well, especially when you have such a large-scale mobilization like Tunisia, where there are variations depending on different cities and provinces and so on and so forth. But I wanted to particularly focus on right now and how IS is looking at Tunisia's forthcoming municipal election. One of the things to note is that 2 months ago in mid-March, or I guess it's not 2 months ago, maybe a month ago, IS's weekly newsletter, Al Naba, put out a statement or an essay talking about Tunisia's election and the idea of democracy. And of course, anybody that follows jihadi ideology, it's a huge issue since they view democracy as a separate religion from Islam. And for them, because this would be such a huge victory for Tunisia's transition, I think that there is a possibility that in the upcoming municipal election, which is May 6th, that we could see violence. This isn't mere conjecture per se, since one of the things we've seen over the last few weeks in other contexts with elections is that IS has hit registration places where people have tried to register in places like Iraq as well as Afghanistan. So I would not necessarily be surprised if we saw something similar in Tunisia, because I think for them it would be important to discredit the whole process especially in the areas that are outside Tunis, because this would then show that, you know, the Tunisian government can actually provide security after all of these years. And while that's not necessarily means that there will be violence, since IS and Sinai also threatened violence during the Egyptian election about a month ago, and that didn't take place. So you also have to understand intent and capacity. But I do think it is something to think about, especially since the way that they're arguing. One of the things that they mentioned in this Naba article was talking about how you had, they didn't specifically talk about Ennahda, but it was a clear implicit discussion about them, how Ennahda's main argument was that we would bring religion to society through these elections, which is a main argument that many within the mainstream Muslim brotherhood type groups have made over the years, and that look at what's happened over the last few years, nothing has changed in Tunisia, it's still mainly run by secular governments, that the proposals that Ennahda tried to do from 2011 to 2014 didn't be put in, whether it's related to issues on blasphemy, whether it's related to gender equality issues and rolling them back, and more recently debates about inheritance and the equality in inheritance, which is likely to pass in Tunisia in the near future, which for them, they cite as an illustration that Ennahda has not lived up to their promise of using democracy to bring religion back within society in Tunisia. And they then use different proofs within the Quran. Of course, you know, this is their own interpretation of that, and other Muslims might disagree with how they use that. But it is important for them in trying to talk to the Tunisian population in public that might see this as something that resonates with them. Since there is a lot of grievances still, many people feel that many of the promises from the revolution have not been fulfilled. It is true that many of the political things have gone forward, but still the economic problems remain. And I think that for many that feel hopeless, some of these messages are useful to them. It provides them with a way to think about a positive future where they can go back against these authorities and individuals that promised stuff and then didn't follow through. And it's not that something that's so abstract where in the past a group like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State would talk about going all the way back to the 7th century in the original caliphate, but now they can point to, look, we had this government and state set up in Iraq and Syria, and to a lesser extent in Libya, which is right next door, and many Tunisians, of course, were joining up with there. So there is something that somebody could potentially hold on to as another hope in the future. So it is something that continuously needs to be looked into, especially since there's a growth in the prison population in Tunisia with many people involved, and that's also historically been an area where people plan the future whenever they get released from prison, and what could that mean to Tunisia in the future if things don't completely remain as stable as it has been over the past couple of years. So I'll just leave it at there for now, and thank you for this, David.
So one of the things I'd like to dig in on is this question of the role of the democratization process. So in our report, one thing we found in Tunisia in particular is that, so the ISIS files we looked at, they ask you who recommended you to ISIS or who is the recommender. It's not quite clear what that means in terms of were they recruiting you? Are they someone who can be called up or sent something to confirm you? That's not quite clear. But one of the things we found in Tunisia is that a large number of these people listed recommenders with known links back or who came out of the Ansar al-Sharia movement and organization, including one we found, Kamal Zarrouk, who, as was the case with a number, was openly touring Tunisia in the aftermath of the revolution, something that's hard to imagine under the Ben Ali regime. On the other hand, it's hard to say that taking the authoritarian route would have prevented this, given that you have this revolutionary upsurge, and it didn't prevent that. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how North African governments or the US and its partners should be walking the line between forms of democratization that produce openings for jihadist organizing and lack of democracy that prevents the sort of resolution of marginalization or lack of inclusion that seems to, in many ways, be at the root of the problem in the first place?
I mean, for me, I don't necessarily think that the opening of society in of itself and participation led to this large mobilization of individuals and reemergence of networks within Tunisia after the revolution. I mean, for me, the original sin of the revolution was letting people out of prison that had been convicted for terrorism previously. I'm not talking about the political prisoners, they definitely should have been left out, but there were definitely hardened individuals that had been to Iraq, Afghanistan, had been involved in terrorist attacks and plots in Europe. If they were not let out of prison, I don't think that there would have been that same kind of issue or mobilization within Tunisia. And this was just further hurt by then Ennahda's policies of having sort of this light touch approach where they felt that they could convince individuals to join the government. I think a lot of it was naivete and also hubris on their part that they would convince jihadists that wanted to overthrow not only Ben Ali's authoritarian system, but also a democratic system to set up their own theocratic state, that they would be willing to join a democratic process. So a lot of what's happened over the last few years, I think, is sort of trying to put everything back in Pandora's box. And I think that Ennahda's learned a lot from that experience as well, as we've seen in terms of their approach and the way they discuss these issues now. So I'm unsure it's necessarily the type of problem that there was from 2011 to 14 or so. For me, the biggest concern is what's going on in the prisons now, and the future of the movement is happening there. Unfortunately, we don't really know what's going on specifically. You know, a lot of that's up to the authorities in Tunisia and trying to, you know, rehabilitate individuals, especially those that might be disillusioned or those that are not necessarily quite as involved in the violent aspects of it, since many people were more just focusing on things in terms of online activism or on-the-ground proselytization. So I think that there needs to be a separation, understanding the levels of whether somebody was actually involved in violence or not.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think there's also a big factor in the Tunisia case, which is Libya, and that
Sure.
you know, Libya is next door and it's in chaos. And so the idea that even if Tunisia was doing a much better job at kind of controlling this issue, I mean, I agree completely that letting these really bad guys out of prison was a horrible idea. But the idea also that even if you controlled that, you still have this porous border with Libya and this chaos. And the major terror attacks that have taken place in Tunisia have been Tunisians who go to Libya, train with ISIS, and then come back. And so until the Libyan conflict itself, it quiets down, and until they really are able to control the border, that's always going to happen. But then the issue of kind of democratization overall, I mean, I believe in the Tunisian revolution. I think it was a great thing, but controlled democratization is a lot better to prevent chaos. So some sort of, you know, gradual opening, the liberalization of the country in general could have prevented some of the chaos that just took place right away. So I think if you are, you know, a policymaker and trying to figure out how to stabilize your country, sort of longer, slower democratization or liberalization is probably a better path, but governments don't plan to be overthrown. They don't plan for revolution, so it's not like they could have made that choice.
So how much did, in your view, the 2013, 2014 ISIS mobilization require the Arab Spring revolutions? And then looking forward, are we looking at conditions in the region where we could see a similar rise of revolutionary feeling? And if we don't get that, should we not expect another mass foreign fighter mobilization like what we saw? Or will we see it regardless?
I think there were a number of factors. Of course, the opening in some countries definitely helped out, as I alluded to. But that doesn't take into account why so many people from Europe went or why so many people from South Asia went and other areas as well. You know, part of it was related to the policies of the Assad regime and what they were doing against the Syrian population and all the massacres. Another factor was also the easeability of getting to Turkey to then get into Syria and the growth of sort of the tourism and also outgrowth of Turkish Airlines to another number of places, and therefore it was a lot easier for people to get to Turkey than get into Syria than, say, if somebody wanted to try and go fight in Mali, which is in the middle of nowhere in the desert. So I think that there are distinct factors that led to sort of this unprecedented mobilization in Syria in many respects. I think that it would be hard to reproduce it, but anything is possible. It's hard to predict the future, but I'm unsure that it would necessarily play out in the same avenue that we've seen, especially as more and more countries realize that they can't sort of control these individuals they're letting go, since they will return home. So I think that there will be, further foreign fighter mobilizations in the future, as we've seen, after Afghanistan, you still had Bosnia and Chechnya. After Iraq, you had Yemen and Somalia, and more recently with places like Libya and Mali. But I still think that if you do see a growth in foreign fighters again, it most likely probably would be in Iraq and Syria again, just because it is the heart of the Arab world. And that's sort of where the strongest movements are these days. I will note one cautionary tale is if somehow pure chaos happened in Saudi Arabia, then all bets are off, because that's the home of Islam, and it won't just be the Sunni Salafi jihadists, it'll also be Iran and their Shia jihadi guys and anybody else in between that wants to try and have some kind of claim over the legitimacy over Islam in the world. So that's something that I personally worry about. I don't know if that will ever happen, but it is something that I think would blow Syria out of the water in terms of potential. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea that there's going to be another revolution, I'm not sure I think that's the case. I think that the factors that led to the Arab Spring across the region are all still there. So you're still seeing the same socioeconomic marginalization of particular regions. You're still seeing, with the exception of Tunisia, you're still seeing authoritarian governments. The economies, even in Tunisia, are worse off than they were before the Arab Spring. So all those factors are still there. But I think with the exception of Tunisia, all the other and I guess Libya, all the other leaders have figured that out and learned how to stop it. So you have the extreme case of Egypt, where you have Sisi elected by 97%, and every opposition figure is either in jail or killed or out of the country. But in Tunisia, where you do have democracy, they're still struggling with this of how do you prevent a revolution with limited financial resources. So they don't have the ability to buy off people or to even throw the kind of investment into the marginalized regions that they might wish to in order to kind of stop this. So you could see, I don't think it's going to be a revolution, but you could start to see more people looking for a different outlet, that this democracy thing's not working, the Ben Ali thing didn't work, what else do we have to do? And I think that has driven a lot of people to ISIS. And you see in the South in particular, a number of people who fought in the revolution, Tunisian revolutionaries, who are now fighting with ISIS. So you can see how that train of thought kind of goes. But I'm not sure where that takes us. And I think even if ISIS were to go away tomorrow, you would still see some level of the population, some people who were going to be looking for somewhere to go. So this is why it's so essential. And I think the Tunisian government gets this, but it's so essential to address these issues, the issues that led to the revolution in the first place. Because again, even if they're not going to go to Libya or to Iraq and Syria, they're going to go somewhere, and there will be someone waiting to welcome them into their arms. And again, the report talks a lot about this, that it's not ideology. The North Africans are not going to ISIS because of the ideology, which is what's even scarier, because that means that they're ready to be picked off by kind of whoever is ready to take them.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Sarah, is that in our report, we saw a lot of reporting and other work that suggested that while you do in Tunisia have a meaningful chunk of fighters who are coming from sort of blue-collar backgrounds, which isn't quite what we're seeing in Derna, where it's almost everyone just doesn't have a job, whether that's because they were unemployed before or aftermath of the Libyan revolution and chaos that preceded. But you do have this chunk of blue-collar fighters, but there's a lot of suggestion that it's a squishy blue-collarness, that we see this in Ben Gurdon and Medellin, where it's a large trader population that's interlinked to a iffy sort of smuggling economy where many of them likely don't have access to benefits, where it might be more like day labor. Also, there was sort of Gallup survey work that suggested people who sort of objectively in standard economic measures would be doing pretty well, or the country would be doing well. People felt that due to corruption and other reasons, it actually wasn't benefiting them. And you just finished a big, or not just anymore, did a big report on sort of corruption and feelings on that in Tunisia. How squishy is the sort of feeling of stability in more blue-collar, not unemployed populations?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of corruption is certainly feeding into terrorist recruitment. I mean, this idea that it's one of the many factors of things that have actually gotten worse, not better, since the revolution. You can read my report for more detail, but the idea, I mean, it's not necessarily even that corruption itself is worse, but that the perception of the corruption is worse. This is where we get back to this kind of democracy paradox that because people can now openly talk about corruption, they're talking about it more, which means more people feel like corruption is occurring. And this coupled with massive underemployment, so you have a very educated population in Tunisia, but skills that are not necessarily conducive to the sort of employment opportunities that are there. That also coupled with the informal sector, and the informal economy makes up 50% of Tunisia's GDP. That's huge. So some people are there by choice, and it's a lifestyle. It works for them. They're traders. They're on the border. The border's very porous, and it's easy for them. But others, would prefer to be inside the formal economy, and the government hasn't figured out yet how to capture that and how to kind of make that work for the people, but also for the economy overall. And were they to actually not only capture kind of the tax revenue that would come for that, but just capture people and give them a stable job, give them the ability to have benefits, give them the ability, to have some more self-worth and more dignity, which again fed the revolution. I think that would help a lot with Tunisia's foreign fighter problem.
So before we turn it over to your questions, I wanted to ask about the ISIS recruitment to go to Libya, which our data does not look at, and looks at the period before ISIS really started telling people, don't come to Syria, come to Libya. Aaron, however, recently published a report specifically on fighters who went to Libya. What did you see in sort of the regional differences or local factors, and where does that foreign fighter mobilization sit now that at least the sort of main territorial holdings of ISIS have been smacked down by Libyans and US air support?
I mean, right now, you don't really see that many cases of people still going to Libya. The foreign fighters that are still in Libya are those that had previously been there, whether they're hiding out in central or southern Libya, or whether those more aligned with Al-Qaeda and based in Derna now. But you don't see the large-scale mobilization like we saw in 2015-16 to Libya. Many of the same dynamics are similar to Syria, especially since many of those that went to Syria from 2012 to 2014 went through Libya to get to Syria. So you see a lot of similarities in terms of variation by region and the same type of key hotspots, whether it's Tunis, Bizerte, Kabylie, and Ben Gardan region. So there isn't too much difference. Of course, the concern is because the countries are next to each other and there's greater linkages between the Libyan and Tunisian militants, this could create more issues in terms of down the road, just because even if things are on the down low now, if there's the opportunity, things could heat up again because these networks have been established and created and people know each other. One of the things in particular that was interesting of note for me with regard to the Tunisians that went to Libya is there's this area called Ramada, which is south of Ben Gardan. It's close to the Libyan border as well, which historically I didn't see too many people becoming foreign fighters from there, but a lot of them went, I think there was up to 100 people out of a population of 10,000 that went to Libya to join up with ISIS. So for me, if ISIS was able to bounce back in Libya and they did try and take territory again on the Libyan-Tunisian border, it wouldn't necessarily just be an issue in Bin Gardan, but also Ramada, where you'd have a similar scenario as what we've seen in the Euphrates Valley in Iraq and Syria, where they, broke the borders between Iraq and Syria, and you'd have a possibility that they would be able to do that, and they'd have a potential population that could be amenable or at least acquiescent to it if they came in and were able to set up shop there. Of course, the situation now doesn't look like that's going to happen necessarily, just because they have been pushed back and a lot of their fighters have been killed. But everybody was skeptical of the Islamic State back in 2009 to 2012 and what they're doing in Iraq, and we obviously have seen what has happened since then. So I wouldn't necessarily discount it, but as of now, I wouldn't say it's on the front burner, but it is something to also note in that it's not just Ben Gardan per se, but you also have this other city of Ramada, and therefore it could create this potential future base, especially since you do see the connections between the smuggling black market economy and individuals involved in that, and then joining up later with jihadi groups too.
Well, let's get your questions. We have a mic in the back, so just raise your hand. Let's do right there in the back. Do we have the microphone? So while we get that and set that up, I'll ask another question regarding your recent work on the Libyan fighters, which is, you noted that there was a large flow of fighters from the Sahel to Libya. In our data, that's really something that was new. We basically saw no fighters from anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa or the Sahel, maybe one or two in the records we were looking at. Is that something specific about Libya? Is that a new dynamic?
Yeah, it is. One of the things, historically, is that most people that were involved in militancy in different areas of the Sahel region, it was mainly local insurgencies, whether it was people from Kenya that were going to Somalia, or maybe people from Niger going to Mali, or people from Cameroon or Senegal going to Nigeria. What we really saw is that you then see people going from many of these West African, East African, and those countries up into Libya to join up with IS. And that's one of the things that I think IS was attempting to do, was using Libya as a base to project larger onto other parts of Africa to build up its networks there. Of course, that's been hindered due to the fall of their territorial control in Libya, but also because AQIM and Al-Shabaab are still the strongest actors, at least in their spheres of influence in Mali and Somalia. IS has had more gains in Nigeria, but it is something to think about in the future and what this means of those that did go to Libya that are then returning home, and possible homegrown recruitment in a place like Ghana or Senegal that historically really haven't had these issues, and therefore their governments might not necessarily think it's a big problem in the same way that after the Bosnian conflict, many European states really didn't think too much about their citizens that went there, and therefore that provided an open opportunity for there to be recruitment for then the next decade or so before many governments really taking it seriously. So I do think that there is the possibility that you could see larger growth in that. The only difference, though, is that in Europe there is sort of the minority-majority dynamic, so there's the potential for not only economic grievance, but also ethnic or religious type of grievances, whereas in a place like Senegal, the country is completely Muslim. So there isn't that same kind of dynamic necessarily, and there are outlets for religion there, so it might not take on the same kind of hold, but it is something to note for sure.
So I think we have the microphone set, and I think there was a question in the back row. So let's do that first.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of questions or thoughts, actually, specifically on Tunisia. Tunisia has a bit of a unique history in the Arab world of sort of very state-sponsored enforced secularism from the period of Bourguiba onwards. And your research really looks at the socioeconomic cleavages in Tunisian society and regionalism. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on how those socioeconomic cleavages overlap with sort of religious and identity cleavages between secularist Tunisians on the coast, which is sort of associated with the national narrative of power, and how that sort of the socioeconomic exclusions that you talk about feed into some of those some of the ways in which Islam can be adopted as an alternative identity for people who feel excluded from the power structure there. So that's the first question. And the second question, I'd sort of welcome your thoughts on the effectiveness of a lot of the CVE programming that is done by the US government and other actors in light of your research findings. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So our data from the All Jihad's local report, I think, isn't well placed to throw a lot of light onto this question of the role of secularism. It's worth noting that Tunisia does have that history, and Libya, to some extent, also has a history, although they're both complex. I think one thing that our more localized data really shows is that having that sort of view of secularism may be important, and it's key at the national level, but that doesn't really, at least to my eyes, maybe there is a difference, explain why there are localized hotspots. So I think, again, there's a key role of ideology, but there's also something about having a population with underemployment into the high tens, where you are drawing a fighter population with 70% underemployment that probably would generate anger regardless of whether it's secular or not. But I think you two are better placed to discuss the role of Tunisia's, at least former secular identity, and where that is today.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it's an interesting factor to look at. But the idea, so there's a couple things. First of all, the idea that that there is an Islamist party that is incredibly powerful. You know, Tunisia is almost a two-party state these days, and that Ennahda was in power. I think that helped deter some of the people who might be motivated for more religious reasons to fight, and that's why I think we don't see as much of an ideological driver there. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is in polling, in IRI polling, and in several IRI polls that look at the religiosity of Tunisia, or the degree that Tunisians would like to see a stronger role for religion in the state, that's actually decreasing. So fewer Tunisians want to see more religion in the state. And if you look even at Ennahda voters, the drop is bigger than the general population. Just to say that, you know, as a whole, and I haven't seen this data at the local level, so it would be interesting actually to look at some of the higher neighborhoods and see how this matches up. But overall, Tunisians are actually expressing less interest in a role of religion in the state. And so not necessarily pushing more towards secularism, but I think the idea that you have a strong Islamist party has kind of helped address that issue, and that people feel like they do have an outlet for religion, they do have a voice for religion, is no longer kind of shuttered or banned.
I agree. I think that the issue of religion in some ways was probably more important for the growth of Ennahda back in the 60s and 70s and 80s than it is for the jihadi movement in Tunisia in some ways. I think that they use the ideas of religion as a narrative that's strong for them, but that's not necessarily why people join up in the first place. It then becomes part of the identity once they join the group, but I think broader inequalities and other issues probably provide that opening for people to be interested in the first place.
And on the CV question, I think the data in our report isn't well placed to really talk about any specific efforts, but I think two of the key lessons that I would draw out regarding CV is first the really critical role of these local dynamics, and beginning with an understanding of the local population and building up from that rather than building down from a vision of what the Islamic State believes. So I think that's critical. And as dynamics, like Sarah was saying about the dangers of having a governance project that just inflames the population in the next town or in the next neighborhood. The second thing is the report really shows the difference between what's happening in North Africa, where there's these very clear socioeconomic factors, and what's happening in a place like the Arabian Peninsula, where there may also be socioeconomic factors. I don't want to say that the fighters we saw in the Arabian Peninsula were wealthy or didn't also have unemployment issues, But you don't see something like Derna in the Arabian Peninsula. Instead, we see things more like Muharraq and the sort of Bahraini element I showed. And I think that suggests that a lot of the counter-ideology work, things like promoting more moderate views of Islam, trying to avoid or downplay radical clerics, probably has an important role in the Arabian Peninsula. I'm doubtful it really has a foundational role in North Africa, which isn't to say it won't reach anyone, but the Derna problem doesn't exist because of radical clerics or extremist ideology. It's rooted in now 4 decades plus of marginalization and open warfare, and that's not going to be changed with some tweets or a new figure. So I don't know if you all have things you want to talk about. Let's take another question. In the middle of
Oh, I don't know. Either one. It doesn't matter. I'm sorry.
Well, we can start on the left and then go down the row.
Thank you very much for talking to us today. So it seemed like you were implying that other than North Africa, extremist groups in sub-Saharan and Western Africa tended to be more local and not sending fighters or receiving fighters from the Islamic State. But are there still any major ties between the groups that are cause for concern?
So I can only say from the data we had from the set of 3,500 plus files globally. And in that, there's, I think, fewer than 10 from sub-Saharan Africa. I'd have to go look at the numbers. With that few, I can't really say anything about what that looks like. To the extent I would, it would draw upon others. I note that it doesn't seem to be purely local, given that in the 2015-2016 period, you do see this mobilization to Libya, but I don't know. Do you have thoughts?
I mean, IS Central, their closest ties are probably still to places in the Sinai, Libya, Yemen, and Afghanistan. I think it's more disparate to a place like Nigeria or Mali or Burkina Faso to a lesser extent, just because there isn't the same kind of historical connections between networks and individuals, but also those groups started more local and have more of a local focus than sort of a local plus a regional plus a global focus, if that makes sense.
Let's go down the row.
Hi, so I'm from IRI. Regarding our data on religiosity, I think something that's really interesting is back before the 2014 elections, we saw a fairly large religiosity gap between Ennahda voters and Nida Tunis voters. And what Sarah referred to in a drop in religiosity from Nahda could be indicating that religious voters in Tunisia are jumping ship on Nahda as Nahda repositions itself as a Muslim Democratic Party. So I think that's really interesting because now you don't really see an appreciable religiosity gap in our data between likely voters for Nida Tunis and for Nahda in the upcoming elections. We certainly can look at data on a regional level to see how it matches up with the All Jihad as local report. I think that'd be really interesting. I do have a question though, which is regarding Bizerte. I find Bizerte to be sort of an interesting standout in terms of being a hotspot in that it's coastal, it's not a suburb of Tunis like Douar el-Sher or Etadaman, it's not on the Libyan border like Ben Gardan. So what, in your opinion, explains why we see such a large level of foreign fighter recruitment in Bizerte?
So I'm not sure that we have a great explanation. In fact, it also, one of the things we note in the report is it also appears to be a bit different in protest activity, although that may just be the measure we were using on that. The ACLA data to per capita, it actually has lower than the sort of 4 multi-province regions we looked at. As you noted, also geographically, it doesn't really fit into the understanding of that breakdown. The best explanation I have that was in some of the reporting, and I think may hold true, although it's difficult to see, is that it was the hub of Ansar al-Sharia activity, and it's a network effect there. It was also, you see fighters in the Sinjar records, so there is something about previous networks, I think. Another thing is just the way people were reporting their origins in Bizerte is that we weren't able to see more localized aspects as we were able to draw a little bit out in Grand Tunis. So I do wonder if there's internal peripheries again. I don't know if you two have thoughts on what's going on.
I think part of it's related to historical networks of recruitment. And if most people that usually get involved in jihadi groups, it's based off of a family member or somebody that they're friends with. So if there was one entrepreneurial jihadi person that wanted to get involved, that then could snowball over time. And we did see a number of people from Bizerte going to Iraq. And then, of course, one of the Ansar al-Sharia branches was in Bizerte too. So there was already networks there. So it might have just been related to interpersonal relationships than it being related to some type of economic issue or religious or whatever else.
But I think there also is a little bit of the relative deprivation issue there. And this is completely anecdotal, but I had a conversation a few months ago with a couple of young Tunisians from Bizerte who were in Washington for a few days. And they were saying that they were really frustrated that they are on the coast. They have the ability to be this massive, beautiful tourism place. No one goes there. And so I think if you already have the network in place, you can kind of feed into that to say, look at Susa, look at Tunis, why are we not doing as well and not getting the same sort of infrastructure? And that can sort of help feed the narrative.
And I think it's also just, there's a lot of flux in the data, and that may be generated by network effects, by very localized relative deprivation. It may just be, that's the nature of data like this. But even in sort of the eastern coast, we see areas that do produce at a relatively high or medium rate for Tunisia that would seem to be relatively wealthy. Fighters are reporting being relatively well off job-wise. So Monastir is an example of that actually has a surprisingly high rate given the background of its location and elite status, and that the fighters don't seem to be reporting that they're just unemployed from there. However, at least in the eastern coastal region, when you look at it as a whole, the peak that you see in, for example, Monastir is not near the peak you see, for example, in Kabylie in the southern area or a sort of neighborhood level like Editamen and Grand Tunis. So I don't know how much to take from that. I think to do that, you really do need the kind of deep survey work and field work in the region, which is another lesson of this report and thing I think it really promotes is, again, you have to begin from that local aspect and not from the what does ISIS believe, what is ISIS's view. You need to do that too, but it has less explanatory power when you get down to it. Do we have other questions? Let's do up front here.
Hi, my name is Jack Krapansky, unaffiliated. Question about Egypt. In southern Egypt and in the Sinai, how connected are they to the Libya, Tunisia, versus are they more closely related to Syria? And also there's the Yarmouk refugee camp below Damascus, and there's an ISIS fight going on right now. Is that kind of, where will those fighters gravitate towards? Will they go towards Syria and, towards Sinai and Libya, or where else?
So in our report, we didn't look at Egypt. We took a brief look at it and made the call that it looked like it had a lot more to do with and needed to be analyzed with regards to the Levant countries, rather than seeing close connections to this sort of Maghreb, North Africa region we ended up looking at. I'd like to look at it in the future. There does appear to be some element of people who had previous training in Sinai or jihadist experience there, or who had fought in Gaza. What to make of that and how significant it is, I can't really say from the look that we did. The files we looked at have basically nothing to say about within Syria, because to have entered into these files that we got, you basically had to come through the Turkish border. So it doesn't really have anything to say about people who joined ISIS from within Syria. I don't know if you have thoughts to talk about.
In terms of the connections, there are definitely connections between Al-Qaeda and ISIS networks in Libya and in Egypt, whether it's people that went to Sinai to get training and then go back to Libya, or people that went from Sinai in Egypt to go into Libya for safe haven or training to then go back into Egypt. So there are connections within those networks for sure. It doesn't really specifically have anything to do with Syria, though. It's more just the regional dynamics there. In terms of what's going on in the Yarmouk camp, I mean, ISIS has had a presence there for a few years now, but they're pretty isolated and they haven't been that connected to the rest of the organization that has been more in the northern and eastern parts of the country. So these individuals will either likely be killed by the regime, which wouldn't be surprising, or they'll escape and maybe try and go down into Daraa to join up with Jaish Khalid ibn al-Walid, which is a ISIS affiliate in the Daraa region on the Israeli border. So that seems a possibility.
Thank you very much. Have you shared your report with the Tunisian government, or have they expressed an interest? And the IRI surveys, are the Tunisians or regional governments looking at those reports?
I don't believe we have. We've briefed a number of people, but I don't remember anyone specifically from the Tunisian government. The report's available online, so hopefully people who work on interested issues and can do that kind of deep local look, hopefully will take a look and it can move forward.
Eddie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they speak with the Tunisian government all the time. IRI briefs the Tunisian government at the local level, at the national level all the time, and they're very interested.
Parties, Prime Minister's office, President's office, embassy here, everyone.
Any more? In the middle there.
Stanley Kober. I'm having some difficulty following this discussion. I can understand the part about people being marginalized and they may even resort to violence to deal with that. What I can't understand is the complete absence of moral restraint, the indifference to human life. I don't understand how you get from being unemployed to just murdering children randomly. There's a process that is going on here, and we're not talking about isolated phenomena. We're talking about a mass movement.
So for our report, the thing I'd emphasize is one of our sort of guiding views on this is looking at individual motivation is actually somewhat of a dead end for terrorism analysis. People have too many motivations. The motivations are too complex. Even just with any human action, why does someone do what they do? So our sort of approach was to try and pick the analytical level up a bit from designing or looking at an individual terrorist profile, but then also not at the level of what does ISIS really believe, which in our view also misses this kind of highly localized context, which is the pattern that shapes us. So one of the things we saw actually in our report is at the local level, people who joined ISIS actually don't look all that different, at least in the very limited socioeconomic factors at a broad level we have from anyone else in that area. But it's important that that area looks different from another area. So it's not that people from Etidhaman look particularly jihadist or that there's something different about them. And in fact, obviously, in any of these cases, the rates are so low in sort of overall terms, you can't go that way. But there's something important that it looks different what's going on in Etidhaman than on the eastern coast of Tunisia. And one of those is producing fighters at a high rate, and one of those isn't. I think there's clearly a need to have moral condemnation. It's just in terms of the analytical effect of that, there's not all that much value to a counterterrorism strategy, and it doesn't lead us to a resolution of, as terrorism scholar John Horgan has put it, more than 4 decades of looking into the terrorist profile, which has produced basically nothing.
I mean, I think obviously there's a big leap between being unemployed and becoming a terrorist. But I think if you look particularly at the Tunisian case, what we've been talking about up here, this idea of the loss of dignity, and that it's not just that you're unemployed, it's that you have a college degree, in some cases you have an advanced degree, and it takes you 8 years to find a job. You can't feed your family, you have nothing left. And in some cases now you have a revolution which promised you democracy and promised you all these wonderful things and a better economy and a better life. And guess what? Your life is actually worse than it was before. So you're angry, you're frustrated, and you have nothing to lose. And if you look at the literal spark that started the Arab Spring, which was Mohammed Bouazizi setting himself on fire, he was also, he was employed in a sense. I mean, he had a produce cart, he was selling produce, but illegally, he didn't have a permit. And something set him over the edge. He could have just gone home and been angry that he got accosted by the police, but he literally set himself on fire. And he didn't do that to start a revolution. He did that because he was frustrated and angry. So I think we can't get into the mindset of every single terrorist, nor should we try to. But it's the thing that's dangerous is that a lot of these countries, and particularly Tunisia, it's gotten past the point of unemployment. It's at the point of loss of dignity where you feel like you have nothing left. And that's where the terrorists themselves on the other side are preying on that, and they know how to psychologically manipulate people and get them to join.
I'll just add that, look, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, their ideologies are totalitarian and violent by nature. So when somebody first joins the group, they might not necessarily be like that, but through socialization, culturalization within that, and then group dynamics, they'll become violent like that. So it's not necessarily surprising that that happens, and we see that with other violent movements too. It's not necessarily specific to jihadists per se. While this doesn't necessarily specifically have to do with Tunisia, more of Western context, what's been an equalizer in this too is the fact that some people can watch their videos online for hours and then through that be motivated, and because of something that switches in their mind, they then decide to do an action as well. So there's one, a potential group dynamic, but two, somebody that could literally watch 24/7 these types of content, which could lead to it as well. Since if you've watched their videos, they're very emotive and visceral, and you will feel something, even somebody that doesn't even agree with them or believe in it. So I think that that's important to understand too, which draws out this violence as well.
Do we have any other? Down in front here.
Thank you. I was just wondering where your data came from and when did you first receive it?
So this data is brought out of Syria. It's more or less, we believe, the same data that the Combating Terrorism Center used and analyzed. We can't fully confirm that, but based on both a look at specific individual matchups there, as well as the broad demographic findings, as well as its origin. And so CTC looked at that with the military. The military had, I believe, 98% of these files were corroborated that they at least had it. Now, whether that means it's necessarily authentic, but our sort of judgment is it's authentic. I think that's always something that you have to wonder about with these kinds of captured, leaked, stolen documents out of a terrorist group. Our sort of sense is, given that these kind of records have been used by others, that they've been picked up by multiple journalists elsewhere, is that these are authentic. Any more? Over here on the right.
I just looking at the ISIS flows from Europe into the Levant, there's something that may be counterintuitive. The wealthier countries, the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, had a higher proportion of extremists traveling to Syria than maybe the less wealthier countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy. Even if you look at the Muslim populations among those, it was still a higher proportion in the Scandinavian countries. And so my question is, someone's theory was you have to be a little bit wealthy to be jihadist, meaning that if you were too worried about putting food on the table, maybe you weren't too worried about a global Islamic movement. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, whether it's still applicable in the North Africa region, and overall your thoughts on it.
So I think that's sort of a key thing to think about, whether there's a level of not having a job or just poverty that means you're just not capable of joining a terrorist organization, or even just not interested, and you need to have a certain level. And I think that's important to look at. I think maybe you see that in sort of Fezzan and southwestern Libya, which produced no fighters in our data, despite having been very marginalized. In the report, we go into a couple of reasons why understanding that marginalization may be different than what the East experienced, in addition to the clear ideological elements, as well as highly localized loyalties there, whether to particular ethnic groups and leaders or to existing al-Qaeda networks. I haven't looked at that European data very much, so I don't want to confirm any particular pattern there. What I'd emphasize is one of the lessons of this report, All Jihad is Local, is it's not that there's one ISIS pattern of radicalization. It's very varied, and it comes up from the local level, and there seem to be regional patterns. So my guess is that Europe has a very different regional pattern. And then within Europe, you have localized patterns. So I would suspect that France looks a lot similar in some ways to Tunisia, but in that it may have these sort of working class, marginalized neighborhoods that are producing, but then also has some element of a broader ideological aspect generated by the particularities of French society. And then if you go to the US, I think in the United States, we have a much smaller problem. And we also don't really see the kind of marginalized neighborhood recruitment. You could potentially argue that in Minnesota we have something like that, but that's still, even at the highest level you choose to look at that, is just not anywhere close to what it means to live in Derna.
I would just add that I think a lot of it also has to do with whether there's local networks and also the government policy in those particular countries. So I think in most Northern European countries, they're not as harsh on these networks as your Western European countries in terms of cracking down upon them, arresting them. And then also in places like Spain, after the Madrid train bombings, they pretty much rolled up all the networks, and since then they've been working with the Moroccans to suppress as much as possible. In Portugal, there's really no history of jihadism. In Italy, the Italian government since the mid-2000s has been deporting people from the country, so there isn't the opportunity for mobilization. So I think part of it has to do with the historical networks and the ability for mobilization, but also the level of harassment by government against these networks too. So I would suggest that in Northern Europe, they probably weren't really doing too much with regard to these networks, and therefore they're able to more easily travel. Since, historically, I think most people would recognize that Northern European countries have softer policies on jihadi groups than more of the Western or Southern European countries.
To go back, that's a lot of what we sort of, in our report, think is happening in Bahrain, where you have this large number of group who say Turki bin Ali recommended them. That seems to be probably some level of actual recruitment there, especially given he has family members in the records. And he was preaching there, and for at least a while, relatively protected by his prominent status, which looked a lot different from North Africa, where at least until you get this broader opening in the revolutionary period and its aftermath of conflict, you would not really be able to preach in that manner in a country like Libya or Tunisia, or to the extent you did, it would require a very different social position and security planning than it would for an elite figure like Ben Ali in Bahrain. So unless there's any other last questions. Yep.
I have a quick question that's likely beyond the scope of the All Jihad is Local report, but wondering if anybody has any comments. I think in a lot of the Western countries, I know particularly in Spain, in France, in Belgium, and the Netherlands, a lot of their foreign fighter output, or the folks that left for Syria and Iraq, were of North African descent. And I'm wondering if, one, there's in any data in any of your work that comes across linkages between networks of second, third generation immigrants in those countries from the North African countries and the foreign fighters who came directly from Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, et cetera. And then the second thing is just a thesis-related thing related to the idea that all jihad is local. And I know this data may not be available, but if you trace the municipalities of where folks in Western Europe who came from North Africa were initially from, in Morocco, in Tunisia, et cetera, do you expect that it would map onto the municipalities that you would find to be of a high proportion of foreign fighter output in North Africa, or would there be other factors, maybe historical things they came too early that would prevent that from happening, or you would see different municipalities being important?
I don't know. We didn't really look at that European data for this report. There's certainly linkages back and forth, and you see that to some extent in where people reported they traveled, that they often do report, or not often. This is still low percentages, but you do see reporting of travel to Europe for tourism or work among many of the Tunisian fighters and others in North Africa. I think that just requires looking into European data.
In terms of the second part of your question, I think that's probably too granular to know specifically. It would be awesome, though, to really know that. In terms of the first part, there are definitely linkages, whether it's people that were from Tunisia that then became radicalized in Europe and then went back to Tunisia after the revolution. So a good example of this is somebody like Boubacar al-Hakim. He's French-Tunisian. He joined up with ISIS in Iraq in 2002, 2003, and then was imprisoned in France. And then after he was let out, he went to Tunisia after the revolution and joined up with Ansar al-Sharia. He was then involved in the plots to assassinate 2 secular politicians. And then after that, went to Libya to do some training. Then he went to Syria and became one of the senior external operations leaders for ISIS. So that's just one example, but there are also a number of cases of French Tunisians that went to Tunisia after the revolution and joined up with Ansar al-Sharia. And then there's also the linkages between sort of one of IS's elite groups, Katibat Batar Libya. There's a bunch of people there from France and Belgium, and many of those were people from North African countries originally. And then some of those individuals then went to Libya in 2015 and connected with the networks that were already in Libya and the Tunisian networks. So there's sort of that mixing and matching there as well. So there's different ways of looking at it, but there are definitely connections that are there for sure.
So I want to give you both the chance for any concluding remarks, but also ask you, looking forward, what is the pattern or issue that gives you the most optimism for the North African region, either regarding ISIS, jihadism, or just more broadly, and what worries you the most in the next 5 years?
I always try to end on a positive note, so I'll do the negative first. I think, first of all, thank you again for having me. I think this has been a great discussion. But both the things that gives me the most hope and the most fear is the decentralization process in Tunisia. That on the one hand, you have the opportunity. Actually, I'm going positive first, but you have the opportunity to actually address some of these local grievances. You have the ability to empower people at the local level. I mentioned I was in Sidi Bouzid a couple months ago talking to young people and civil society actors and people running for the local elections, and they're very hopeful. What they want to see is local control over their local affairs. So that's very good. But on the downside, I worry about the expectations. I think there's these really high expectations of what decentralization will bring to the country, which is this idea that you're going to be suddenly flush with resources, that you're going to be able to correct a lot of these imbalances. And in the government's own estimation, this is a 27-year process. People are not patient for 27 years, nor should they be. I mean, I asked numerous government officials and local activists, what do you want to see in 1 year or 3 months or 5 years? And no one has an answer to that. They're looking at this as a very long-term problem. So I worry what's going to happen in that between now and 27 years from now.
I agree with that. One thing I'll note, which I alluded to earlier, I think if you want to understand at least the future of the Tunisian jihadi movement, you really have to understand what's going on in the prison system right now and the mixing of individuals that join these groups, whether they're homegrown, whether they were foreign fighters, whether they came from Europe. That will really help map out what that means for the future. Of course, there's a huge gap because we don't actually know what's going on in the prison system, but based off of past cases, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in France, whether it's in Tunisia as well from 2006 to 2011, they are planning and they're also trying to recruit individuals that might not actually believe in the ideas at that juncture yet too. So that's something to think about too as well.
Well, thanks to our speakers for a great discussion.